and welcome to this teaching. What were the politics of Iraq and anti-war movement? What did Platypus task itself with, and what, if anything, were the lessons learned? Or rather, anti-war politics, Platypus, and the death of the millennial left. My name's Lucy. I'm a millennial member of Platypus and a founding member of Platypus London. Hi, welcome. And firstly, I should say, for anyone who hasn't managed to yet, Pam Nogales from Platypus did a teach-in 2 weeks ago on Moishe Stone and the first sort of millennial moment of Platypus, and I would really encourage everyone to watch it if they haven't already. This will kind of supplement that, but it won't be as good as that teaching, but I'm going to try. Okay. I've got kind of different sections, and I'm just, so that are titled, I'm just going to kind of read it. War is politics by other means, and yet also war is a crime. In modern society, it might first appear that we should have moved beyond war. It should be possible to resolve issues through trade and negotiation. Benjamin Constant suggested as much, that unlike the ancients, where war was a virtue in the service of the gods, for the moderns, in a world of commerce, it should be overcome. Given this should be, recourse to armed conflict appears unnecessary. Indeed, it is a crime. It is a crime in the sense that Leszek Kolakowski explains it. Crime is right-wing, a concession to the status quo, an adherence to gangsterism, but also right-wing in the sense of a destruction of value, capital, property, human lives. It is wasted potential. But at the same time, war is also politics. It's a form of political negotiation. Chris Cutrone's recent discussions on the Palestinian question on Doug Lane's podcast focus on that, referring to Hegel's term military transactions. We might even consider Prussian military theorist General Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. Whilst it shocks and disturbs our modern sense of morality, if we want to consider how to overcome it, we have to face its reality and consider what are the politics involved. The post-political. I've always found the task of thinking about politics per se quite tricky. This might be because it was not a discourse I was familiar with as an art student, even if we were to say all art is political. But it might also be a historical problem. It might have something to do with what we called in Platypus the post-political of left movements. This was meant as an historical category, an estimation of the post-1989 moment. It then appeared that politics, as the short 20th century had understood it, was over. What remained were policies, public relations, image management, the politics of identity or lifestyle, which the left tried to orient around. But September the 11th, 2001, and the wars that followed were a crisis and unravelling of the post-1989 world order, with a pre-1989 politics bound up in it. This is what Spencer Leonard, in a contribution to a panel on the decline of the left in the 20th century, tried to indicate, that 2001 might have 3 dates bound up in it for the left. 1999, associated with the anti-globalization movement, 1989, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and 1979, the Iranian Revolution. This post-political preceded the anti-war movement, and therefore also the start of Platypus. Platypus considered itself a pre-political project. We tasked ourselves with trying to understand our own moment, and what it would take to transform politics in the future towards emancipatory ends. In Platypus's own history, we've talked about how, in the context of the mass protests of the anti-war movement, there appeared to be a revitalized interest in Marxism. There was a new upswing in activity of Marxist groups. The millennial generation participated in this. I have to say it was not quite recognizable to me at that time in that way. It was only in retrospect and through exploring the history of the left that I could see this upswing towards Marxism had taken place. In 1979, many on the Western left had championed the fall of the Shah in Iran as a democratic triumph and a blow to a monarchy that had been supported by US imperialism, despite the right-wing Islamist character of the Khomeini regime which followed it. Two leading theorists of the 1960s New Left generation, Tariq Ali and Fred Halliday, who took different positions on this question, had a discussion where Halliday suggested to Tariq that God, Allah, called the two of us to his presence and said to us, one of you is going to the left, one of you is going to the right. The problem is he didn't tell us which was which, and maybe he didn't know himself. And Tariq laughed. He understood exactly what I was saying, and he didn't dispute it. It was after this moment that Halliday distanced himself from the New Left review. For Halliday, the question of what was a right and left-wing position in light of a contemporary politics was not quite clear. Had the New Left of the 1960s, in attempting to hold on to the same stance to US imperialism, somehow become right-wing, what would it then mean to be left? After 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the far left, who had already moved in many directions in trying to make sense of crumbling Stalinism, scrambled to take sides. They were marginalised. Marxists that were critical of the Soviet Union supported ambiguous uprisings such as Solidarność movement in Poland, which had been protests against the Soviet Union supported by right-wing forces such as the Catholic Church. But those who continued to support the Soviet Union, even if critically, were also disoriented. I'm thinking of the Spartacists, for example. There was an anarchist upswing around the 1999 World Trade Organization anti-globalization protests. Sections of the Marxist left, such as the ISO in the US, did participate in these, but they were not major players. The character of the 99 protests was predominantly anarchist. The ISO itself was disoriented by its involvement in it, or had disagreements with the SWP over it. It was only the post-9/11 and anti-war movement that the groups that led the protests were of a Marxist character. This, I suppose, to the generation before us, felt like the first time since before 1989. The question of the moment for these Marxists was imperialism, specifically the invasion of Iraq by the United States. But what was meant by imperialism? Was that what we were seeing in 2003? What, if so, with a continuity and change in the concept of imperialism, since Lenin first conceptualized it in the context of World War I, or since the anti-imperialist movements of the 1960s and 70s? The politics of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement and the left in this moment did have a politics, but in Platypus we felt it necessary to make the implicit explicit. In the war, we were dealing with the legacy of Stalinism, the Cold War, and neoliberalism. All three of these things produced the three following phenomena: a politics of bin Laden's Islamist anti-US imperialism, anti-Westism, a politics of Saddam Hussein and the Baathists, and the politics of the United States and its allies. We might also consider the politics of Europe in sort of being anti-war as well, but not aligning with Islamism. In any case, and then the politics of the political character of the anti-war movement itself was, rather than standing independently and opposing all of these positions, it said, whose side are you on? Out of weakness and hopelessness, it said, which really is the lesser evil out of bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, or the United States? And even, who really is asking for their comeuppance? Who did the left think they were supporting, and to what end? Was that helping or inhibiting the task of socialism? By socialism, we understood it by its historic meaning, the international working class political movement to overthrow capitalism. This began to raise the question of whom in politics. The left thought its actions could use the anti-war movement to build its organisations. The organisations appeared to understand themselves as working for socialism to overcome capitalism, but the left's actions served other political interests and delivered other ends. In the anti-war movement, one of these primary ends was the election of the Democrats in the United States with Obama in 2008, and in the UK, it was the election of the coalition government led by David Cameron of the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives in 2010. My encounter with the left. When I asked the SWP at an anti-war meeting in 2004 or 2005 what the nature of the protests were, why there were all these different groups on the protests, including the Palestinian Solidarity groups, and what it had to do with the war on Iraq, I was told that the different groups that were there because they were united in trying to overcome capitalism, that a world still ruled by capital would never overcome war. I remember feeling that this was a really interesting and powerful idea I'd not heard before, that one could not overcome war without overcoming capitalism. But I also doubted that most of the people on the protests were really committed to that project, and it was a little deceitful to suggest that they were. I was also not sure yet about the premise either. I'd experienced liberal outrage to the war and indeed to imperialism. The liberal outrage took the form of a claim on democracy. We didn't vote for the war. It was not in my name. It was a call for a regime change in our own countries, the US, UK, etc. There are no weapons. Saddam Hussein is not a threat. No weapons of mass destruction. This was all US propaganda. Or to the extent to which Saddam was a threat, it was the West's fault, and the US acts as the global policeman but wreaks havoc everywhere. Also that the West was asking for September the 11th. This was part of a long line of imperialist behaviour, and the underdog, Islamist anti-West politics, was fighting US hegemony. The Marxist left appeared to support this liberal outrage, and it's not as if these things were entirely without basis. We did not vote or agree for the war. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and I felt quite strongly against the war on both those grounds. I found out from my subsequent reading that yes, indeed, the US had played an ambiguous role in propping up Saddam's Ba'athist party against communist groups in Iraq, and the US was and is a global hegemonic power. But it was possible to be against all those things without any guiding perspective of overcoming capitalism, let alone without a Marxist perspective. The motivation of Platypus. This motivated the founding members of Platypus in two ways. Platypus had been founded by Chris Cutrone, a teacher at the University of Chicago and School of the Art Institute, and some of his students. And the first generation of millennials in Platypus, Chris Cutrone students, were motivated to ask questions. And an older kind of generation zero of Chris and some of his peers felt tasked to teach. The subject was Marxism and the question, what is imperialism? To Platypus, Platypus encouraged us to consider imperialism as a question, but a question not about oppression, but rather a problem of freedom, albeit a problem of freedom in distress, in crisis. We returned to Marx and the Second International ideas to explore this problem. Second International Marxists' ideas to explore this problem. For Marx, capitalism was not an ahistorical question about oppression that required resistance, but a historically specific question about freedom. Imperialism, produced through capitalism in its overripe stage, contained this same question. It seemed to us that memory of this has been lost in the 20th century, or perhaps had been difficult to grapple with and so was ignored in favour of resisting oppression. So we kept asking about it. Our attempt to host conversation was to this end. The left had arguments about how to orient towards the anti-war movement. Different groups would uphold different aspects of the legacy of the Second International Marxism. These fragments of memory the left held were about historic disputes. For the left, these debates were attempts to adjudicate both the past and the present. The legacy of Stalinism and struggles against it loomed large, but sometimes these debates were very obscure, and the left's activities seemed to recapitulate or form new Stalinisms. In 2010, a panel Atiyah Khan referred to, in a 2010 panel that we held, Atiyah Khan referred to Stalinism by Trotsky's phrase, an organization of defeats. What was meant by this is the organisation around a project which characterised political defeats as victories. In a more broad sense, it meant erasing historical memory. I have a cartoonish example of the latter. Just recalling the first time that Pam Nogales and I went to Marxism Festival, the SWP event in 2011, we met Lindsay German, who had been a prominent member of the SWP and Stop the War Coalition. When Pam said to inform me at the time, "Oh, it's Lindsay German, a leading member of the SWP. Nice to meet you," she said in reply, "I've never been a member of the SWP." This was following a split in the SWP over the involvement in the Respect Coalition, which I can come back to in discussion. But the general narrative was that the struggle continues somehow, no matter what organisation you're in or anything, or what the debate had just happened was. We instead tasked ourselves with brushing the history of the left against the grain, and involved exploring this sort of symptomology of the present left. One early engagement we had, which Pam also talked about, was Chris's interview with Tariq Ali, and who was one of the two in this sort of anecdote I was speaking about earlier with Fred Halliday. But Chris interviewed this prominent New Left activist, Tariq Ali, and our reason for engaging him was that he had this kind of clear anti-imperialist perspective that characterised this moment, that was born of the 1960s New Left. And Chris asked him in that interview, what were the main tasks for the left in the present? He said, if we were bigger, we should build a strong movement against the war. The left needed to build a strong movement against US imperialism. This is quite often the character of leftist politics in the present. It has a provisional, hypothetical character without an acknowledgement of the defeats or how we got there, why we're so small. Ali acknowledged some differences with the Vietnam anti-war movement and the present, but did not take into account the politics of Iraq or Afghanistan. In Vietnam, the anti-war movement, in the Vietnam anti-war movement of the 1960s, the US was fighting communist groups. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it was fighting Baathism and the Taliban respectively. Ali stated the resistance movement to US occupation in Iraq was not all reactionary. He said in the interview that it was US propaganda to say so. At the same time, he argued that Islamist groups in Afghanistan and those resisting US occupation in Iraq were the product of US imperialism. So there was a right-wing character to the US occupation, resistance to US occupation in Iraq. He meant both directly in being supported against political regimes with it. In the US, supporting political regimes with Soviet ties in the Cold War, and indirectly in expressing anti-imperialist discontents, these groups should be supported, even if they were anti-leftist. This produced no other leadership for the Western left, other than being against the US. It also led Ali to denounce the Iraqi Communist Party as shameful in its support for US occupation. Anti-US-ism, as Moish Pastone explained in his interview with Pam and Ben, Pam Nogales and Ben Bloomberg, two millennial members of Platypus, had become a fetish for the left. It made it impossible to critique the reactionary character of forces elsewhere. It acted as an obstacle toward building a truly international working class solidarity in the struggle for socialism. On the question of the Iraq Communist Party, Ian Morrison wrote a piece for the Platypus Review in 2007. He was motivated to dig deeper into the history of Baathism as a symptom of the legacy of Stalinism and the Cold War. He tracked the fate of the Iraqi Communist Party. Unlike the rest of the left, it welcomed the US invasion of Iraq, as I mentioned. He also looked at a Democrat Party member at the time who had defended the Baathist state in the 2004 Iraq protests. Ian argued that this took up from a leading theorist of the Baathist Arab national movement, Michel Aflaq, in that it mitigated the issue of domestic class conflict. Ian charted the 1958 revolution in Iraq and the antagonisms between communists and nationalists. He explored how the ICP undermined itself in their attempt to suppress a pan-Arab revolt, and this descent into inter-ethnic conflict had legitimised the Baathists. He also charted the history of the development of the left in Iraq, including individuals and tendencies who had gone through both the second and the third internationals. He concluded that early catalysts of the left in Iraq, labour reform and theoretical fermentation, were the demands of our own time in the 2000s. This had a slightly unusual character compared to some of Platypus's other statements, because it appeared to make the development of the left in Iraq not just a symptom, but in a sense a model for the present. It also explained his later wish to undertake worker solidarity activity in the context of the 2009 Green Movement, and his interest in making Platypus a kind of theoretical wing for the worker solidarity movement in Iran. But this is just to say, in thinking through the politics of our moment, there were different impulses in Platypus, but at the time, he was holding up this history to the present, to the left who refused to listen to the positions of sections of the Iraqi left, or dismissed or condemned them, as Tariq Ali did. And I want to say something more general about our engagements with the left during this period that had to do with this sort of division between the anti-imperialist and the anti-fascist left, that in a sense it was important for Platypus to emphasise how the left was divided on all major questions, and that these divisions were not accidents but results of one side, or one side being wronger than others, but older splits that hadn't been worked through. But I can come back to it in the Q&A. But but we did sort of recognise that in terms of our own engagements, there seemed to be a kind of dynamic between anti-fascism and anti-imperialism happening, which has a legacy going back to the 1930s, but somehow felt incommensurable to the present. But somehow this categorisation of anti-fascism versus anti-imperialism felt more dominant than perhaps other distinctions that we might make between socialism versus liberalism, or even Stalinism versus anti-Stalinism. Imperialism, in our kind of deeper kind of investigations into the history of ideas around imperialism, Platypus members looked at the character of imperialism post 1848, and this is kind of in a sense in the period after the end of the Iraq War moment and after the election of Obama. But we were still kind of working through, I guess, some of the questions that we'd been raising in the first period of Platypus. We considered Bonapartism as a phrase coined by Trotsky as a critique of Stalinism in the 20th century that pointed back to this earlier history of the 1848 revolution and its contradictions as Marx understood them. And we also considered its Bonapartism, its explanatory potential, not only for Stalinism, but maybe also for the 20th and 21st century capitalist state, reproducing itself in crisis. Bonapartism was produced through attempts to manage the democratic demands of its citizens. And a contemporary example of that were Chris's articles on the Egyptian elections following the Arab Spring. And modern colonialism, as Lenin understood it, once we'd kind of digested Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism, modern colonialism of the late 19th century, we recognised as, or Lenin recognised, was an effect, a symptom of the crisis of capitalism, imperialism, Bonapartism, rather than its cause. And so perhaps the project of decolonisation in the mid-20th century is also an effect of the political shift necessitated by the development of state capitalism and the Cold War, both in core capitalist countries and the developing world. Thus, decolonisation was not a project of socialism, but an obscure attempt to manage interclass conflict internationally. The state's attempt to manage the crisis of capitalism, both within and outside of their own borders, their goal is not the overcoming of capitalism and the nation state, but rather its reconstitution. And Arab nationalism as an ideology might be one expression of this. All of this is to say that whilst various forms of resistance to imperialism have manifested through the 20th and now 21st century, they have not sought to overcome the historical conditions of imperialism, i.e. capitalism, but rather reproduced it in various forms of Bonapartist politics. These have been variously supported or denounced by the left, including both Zionism and Arab nationalism, as it lost its way in the mire of the 20th century. The politics of the neoliberal era play out on this backdrop. I would encourage people to go back and listen to Chris's teaching on empire and state capitalism. It kind of works through Mandel's perspective, Ernst Mandel's perspective, and then explores the continuity and change between Fordism into post-Fordism and neoliberalism. The neoliberal state and interstate politics has both continuity as well as change from a post-war welfare state. Another writer who tried to tease out this continuity and change from a geopolitical perspective was Fred Halliday, who I've talked about earlier. In a book titled The Second Cold War, he charts the continuities and changes between the first Cold War period, post-Second World War, kind of 1946 to 53, through various phases into a second Cold War period after 1979. Halliday writes this book in 1983 after he's distanced himself from the New Left Review over their unequivocal support for the 1979 revolution. And he was also writing in the context of the upswing of the left, of the anti-nuclear disarmament campaigns. Many of the 1960s left had helped to set these up and had influenced a new 1980s generation of activists. Jeremy Corbyn, who had been politicised around the CND in the 60s, had by 83 won his first seat for Labour in Islington North. And it was also at this moment that you had the Women's Peace Campaign on Greenham Common, which is often talked about as kind of a high point of activism in the early 1980s, in 1981 in the UK. And Greenham Common was a nuclear arms base. Halliday seeks to critique the perspectives within this movement and those in mainstream politics. Instead, he aims to arrive at a more nuanced understanding of the character of the Cold War and of the chilling relations between the United States and the Soviet Union under Reagan, after what had been a relatively warmer period of cooperation under Nixon and Kissinger. R.I.P. Kissinger. We might then need to consider from all this how neoconservatism, anti-nuclear disarmament, anti-globalization, and also Islamism have to be reckoned with as neoliberal phenomena. So, any lessons learnt? Through the campaigns, Platypus explored the question of democracy and its character in capitalism. In the absence of a large left-wing movement during electoral unity projects, there are attempts such as the Socialist Alliance, which were argued as under principled or strategic means, but actually in the end had a kind of tailist character. And Chris Catrone sort of outlines in his essay, Iraq and the Election, the Fog of Anti-War Politics, how it was that the anti-war movement in the US resulted in the election of Obama. I kind of briefly mentioned the Respect campaign, but there were various attempts at these unity projects, which is what I'm sort of mentioning too. But groups like the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain, and Alliance for Workers' Liberty despite their experiences in projects like the Socialist Alliance, and then in things like Respect, seem to have learnt nothing from those experiences and entered into further disorientation through their more recent engagement with the Labour Party during the Corbyn era. And one might imagine, in light of the current Israel-Palestine issues, that some of the actors from the Respect campaign might rear their heads again. So I should just explain, Respect was a kind of an attempt, an electoral project by George Galloway, who kind of broke with the Labour Party over the invasion of Iraq, and a lot of leftist groups ended up kind of rallying around him, but he also was able to motivate a lot of Muslim groups to support him during that moment as well. So there was a kind of strange alliance between the far left and kind of various Muslim groups in Britain around the Respect Party, which gained some. I think they were elected in Tower Hamlets, or it might have been Bethnal Green. I've forgotten now, but it created a lot of disorientation for the left at that time. But it was an example of a kind of unity project, I guess, that the left considered itself principled at the time in being involved in. We could consider Galloway had a recent project that I think seems to have imploded, but the Workers' Party of Britain. But you could imagine something similar that would act as a kind of pro-Palestine electoral poll for Muslim voters and for the SWP or Labour left who wouldn't vote for Keir Starmer. But really, to what end would that be moving towards? It kind of seems as if these sort of sectarian groups lurch into action around these projects, but then none of them seem to offer a way forward. And the millennial left too has kind of lurched through and kind of been repeatedly knocked by these various kind of phenomena during since the anti-war movement. And into the transition to kind of post-neoliberalism, as we might see it in the phenomena of Trump and Brexit, sort of been knocked through Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Sanders, Corbyn, and into kind of anti-Trumpism, and now in kind of Palestinian solidarity even further. And we seem to still be in a kind of politics of assumed points of agreement, a kind of whose side are you on? And for Platypus, we had recognised this post-political problem of the 1980s, but maybe we need to recognise that the millennial left, and that might include Platypus, has failed to overcome that moment. That only when the millennial left was really confronted by politics per se, for example in 2016, did it kind of fall below the mainstream discourse. I just wonder whether we have actually managed to overcome this kind of post-political movement. Pam and Ben in their... I'm almost done. Pam and Ben in their interview with Moij Bestone raised the idea of necessary forms of misrecognition on the left. And I would say that Platypus itself is a necessary form of misrecognition. There is a hope that it could exert a force to break down former thought taboos. But it's unclear, actually, if we have done this. However, it does seem to me that there is a kind of undesirable necessity still to Platypus. If the left, including the millennial left, refuses to learn from its defeats, then we kind of still need to kind of keep keep questioning it. The left is still wedded to the Democratic Party in the US and the Labour Party in the UK. And the crime of the Israel-Palestine situation is profoundly unseemly. The millennial left leads the Zoomers in participating in this crime as a spectator, a voyeur, and a cheerleader, not least for Hamas, and has nothing particularly useful to say. After the Second World War, in Adorno and Horkheimer's work, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, they had a message in that work that despite how it might appear, the Allies had triumphed. The Allies' triumph over Hitler was illusory. Hitler keeps winning in the realm of ideology and in the authoritarian personality that extended into the 1960s and into the activist left. Regarding the fallout of the politics of 2001, we might need to say that Osama bin Laden has won and keeps winning. In the absence of emancipatory politics, ethno-nationalism and identity politics are writ large. If it has not, then we remain in Osama bin Laden's world. That's it.
We've got over an hour for
questions
good. And discussion.
Good.
At least in this room. Anyone wanting?
Yes, attendee.
I do have a quick question for how the Zoomers interacted with the millennials during that time. Because as Israel-Palestine show, that does echo a lot from Black Lives Matter, particularly 2020, and even a few schisms of 2014 when most of the Zoomers came of age. I was wondering how much in that for the Zoomer left is it possible for them to find an identity outside of the millennials, like the millennials did? Or will they be echoing the 80s left as carrying the new left's dead corpse for now until their eventual death?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple of things I want to say. One thing that I've been thinking about a bit, well, I think that was possibly why I tried to focus on the post-political moment, to try and dig into that a bit, understand it a bit more. But maybe I don't know how successful it was. But I do think there is a question about whether we've overcome the 1980s moment and whether we're still living in it. I didn't really talk about identity politics much in this, but obviously that is sort of definitely part of the I guess it starts in the 60s, but it does kind of institutionalize itself as a kind of phenomena in the 1980s. And there is a way in which actually the character of the protests today feel more about identity politics than even the question of imperialism, which is interesting to consider. And that it is about kind of ethno-nationalism rather than necessarily about a kind of the US or Israel. Even though there is kind of a rhetoric around Israel and the US as kind of like exporting imperialism. It's kind of it's an odd thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question to what you just said. yeah, are they still taking up that kind of anti-imperialism because it was there before, so they have to regurgitate it now, and but identity politics is still taking center stage for the Zoomers.
Yeah, I think so. What do others think?
I can jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things Lucy tried to raise is the felt appearance in 2003 to 2007, say, of a resurgence for self-avowed Marxist groups that had more or less been sidelined in the 90s. And it was predominantly the Cliffite tendencies, so the SWP in Britain and the ISO in the United States, that were kind of leading the Stop the War coalition and the anti-war movements. I'm not sure about the present. Like, I think there is less of a character of that. Obviously, if you look at the marches, everyone's carrying a socialist worker printed banner. But
Stop the War Coalition.
Or Stop the War Coalition, but I think there is less of a kind of like people talking about Marxism and imperialism than there was at that earlier time. It does feel that the type of activism is more inspired by the kind of BLM protests of 2020. But there is also this kind of Zoomer Stalinism and Zoomer Maoism. And there is a kind of shamefaced left correction post-Corbyn that's kind of led by the millennials, but the Zoomers kind of go with. And that is to say that they're now kind of embarrassed about the fact that they entertained the idea that they were going to like vote socialism in 2017 or 2019 or whatever. And there's a kind of self-correction to a kind of to grasp for a kind of radical veneer, having gone through their like sensible reformist phase, and that takes the form of taking up a kind of certainly glorifying violence in a way that is familiar from parts of the New Left in the later 60s and 70s, but also reaching for kind of the way that reaching for kind of aspects of Stalinism, really, that endorsed third world nationalism and anti-colonial movements in the New Left era. So there is a kind of a reach for that, and I think it's motivated by the fact that we are still living in a kind of downturn after the failure of neo-social democracy and the failure of Corbynism. And that's, so it is still all about their kind of begging to differ from the Labour Party. And any kind of, I think it's interesting to bring up whether there might be a kind of Respect Coalition Part 2 type of thing. But the point about that would be to say that it is a kind of loyal protest movement within the Labour Party, right? That never actually broke the bounds of what the kind of limit that Labour Party politics places on the left in its kind of historical imagination. But one other thing that I wanted to kind of say in response, which is, first of all, a kind of point of clarification, which is, and I don't think you meant this, but just to make sure it's clear, that the Iraqi Communist Party didn't welcome the invasion of Iraq by the US, but once it had happened,
yes,
they were willing to participate in the attempts to set up a provisional sort of polity that were led by the US, and they didn't endorse the kind of sectarian violence against the occupation, like by any means necessary, as people now say. And that meant that they were disavowed by large parts of the Western left. And what that kind of points to is the way that a lot of, and this kind of goes to what I was saying about the left post neo-social democracy taking up a kind of radical veneer, which is that the left is dead, right? So it's practically has no effect on the politics either here really, but definitely not in Iraq. And kind of sort of active, alive left would be thinking about what the consequences of its positions were vis-a-vis the left and the organised working class on the ground in these countries, and they would have actual stakes, and so they would kind of orient their positions around those. And it's precisely when the left has no involvement, no like practical stakes, that it can take these kind of seemingly more radical but actually just delusioned and helpless positions of being like, no, fuck the negotiations, just blow everything up, or just support the resistance, whatever its political character, no matter how right-wing, how Islamist. And you see that today, obviously, where there is no sense of having a political possibility for organising the working class or the left in Israel-Palestine. There is no political project for the left in its kind of conception, and so it kind of endorses the nihilism there. Last point, and then I'll hand over to other people. I think one of the important things that your teaching has kind of raised about platypus, and it might come across a bit strange, like insisting on talking about who's a millennial and who's a zoomer and all this kind of stuff. What the project that we are engaged in is trying to get people to think about history, and specifically to think about how the present is historical, and to actually kind of make history palpable in the present. Because the general modus operandi in society at large, but also on the left, is a kind of ahistorical oblivion. And I think you talked about this in terms of a kind of ahistorical struggle against oppression. But there's a way of liquidating not only deep historical memory, but recent historical memory. So, you know, what you did, like Lindsay German, memory holding her lifelong career in the SWP. You know, when things fail, they just pretend like it doesn't happen. And Platypus is really trying to kind of brush against the grain of that, and to force people to think about how the present is historical. And that's why we try to have this sense of, okay, what was our moment? Who were we, like, how was this moment formed? How is it different from what came before? Where was the continuity? How does it relate to historical developments within capitalism? How is it that the history of the left is being recalled in the present and is being cited by leftists as justification for what they were doing? Because it definitely seems that, you know, it was already the case in the 60s that there were people who were saying, look, the problem with the left is that we're just repeating slogans from the 20s and 30s, like imperialism, and it actually doesn't make sense to explain the world now. That doesn't mean that people were wrong to use it then, but we need to have a Marxism that's somehow adequate to our times. And at the same time, it seems impossible to kind of totally ditch those categories, right? People who are like, therefore we're never going to use them, also end up just repeating the past, but perhaps even in a more unconscious way. And so we're trying to, I guess, turn that liability into an asset and say, okay, you seem to be haunted by the past, you seem to be compelled to say imperialism, even when it's not clear that that explains the world. Certainly not the situation that Lenin was talking about, of inter-imperialist rivalry between Britain and Germany. So I guess the question for us now is, on the left today, to the extent that there seems to be a repetition of some of the symptoms of the 2003 to 2008 anti-war movement, of endorsing kind of any reactionary opposition, and of throwing out the window the question of what is left and what is right and why these terms might matter. Can we see like the history of the left being cited, and is that something that we can still use as a jumping off point to kind of work through, maybe this is a chance for you to expand on the anti-imp versus anti-far like history. Is that something that we can still use to try and work through those kind of accumulated obstacles?
Yeah. Yes. There was a kind of so I think it's in the Chris's presidential report of 2011. He's kind of brings up this distinction of the anti-imp versus the anti-far left, which was really to do with our engagements in learning from our engagements in Germany, and also in general up to that point, I think in the context of the anti-imperialist kind of moment of millennial left, our kind of way of sort of pushing against that or brushing against the grain was, in a sense, to foreground voices from the anti-fascist left who appeared to have a kind of critique, however partial, of the anti-imperialist left. But there was a way in which that those categories appeared to be the most prominent in terms of distinguishing between different left groups, even though there were kind of others that you could point to. But that one also kind of has its own history, and I guess one, we were trying. As Ephraim was saying, the left does also kind of cite from history, and is also adjudicating both on like the present and the past at the same time, as I was sort of mentioning. So one, in the context of the anti-war movement, there were lots of conversations about Trotsky's idea of the United Front, which was like a united front against fascism, as it was originally conceived of, but in this case it was a kind of united anti-imperialist front of some kind in the UK, or it's not quite clear. And various people kind of like various groups were for or against that sort of idea. The CPGB was like, that's a Trotskyist kind of dead end, the United Front, whereas like other groups were saying, no, we're in a united front. And I guess at the time, Chris showed. I've got here. There's a page in. You're not going to be able to see it really, but there's a page in Tarek Ali's book on Trotskyism for beginners. This is kind of like cartoon book, which is kind of sort of pointing at that moment to kind of. This is Trotsky's proposal in the early 1930s of creating a united front of communists and like social democrats against fascism, which the Stalinist left says is like, no, it accuses of being social fascism. That's the kind of accusation of Stalinists to Trotsky, that they're social fascists for like allying themselves with social democracy. And then, of course, later on, like, it might seem as if Trotsky was right because, like, Hitler gains power, and then there's this kind of moment of like later on, there's a kind of, within the argument that Trotsky's making, there's a kind of distinction between the United and the Popular Front, and so at the time during the anti-war movement, there was like, what are we in a united front? Are we in a popular front? What is this? And you might, I don't know if that terminology is being used again now or not, but maybe not. But obviously later on, like the start, during the Second World War, there's the Hitler-Stalin Pact, so that's a case where like there's a kind of agreement, a kind of non-aggression agreement between communism and Nazism, and in a sense that is against like Western social democratic imperialism.
Right.
But I guess that was all like quite obscure to like how the anti-fascists maybe and the anti-imperialists in the anti-war movement were kind of thinking through these things. But they did appear to be like these two kind of almost like antinomious kind of aspects of the left, which we in Platypus were trying to kind of bring together in different ways to kind of talk to each other to greater or lesser success, but that was our aim. And of course, there was another aspect to this in terms of the history of imperialism. So that we kind of recognised as we started reading some of the Second International Marxists, where we'd see how groups like the SWP would sort of support Lenin's view of like Lenin's characterism of imperialism over Luxemburg's, because Luxemburg had this kind of much apparently more like clear dismissal of the kind of national self-determination question, whereas like Lenin appeared somehow more sympathetic to it, or that's the way they saw it. And then on the flip side, you'd get the kind of anti-German tendencies who would celebrate Luxemburg but dismiss Lenin. And so actually our engagement on the German left had to be to kind of foreground Leninism in a way, which has meant that like Platypus at different points has been misrecognized as like either being kind of ultra-Leninist in some way, or as being pro-imperialist, and so because we've attempted to kind of bring these different aspects of the left together in conversation, that's meant that we've been misrecognized in different ways throughout that period. Yes.
I have a quick question about the category of the millennial left, right? We kind of discussed this or brought this up during the coffee break earlier this week, of kind of the death of the millennial left, or kind of, what does it mean to have a death that didn't quite begin? So there's this kind of it's a fraught category that I think Platypus is one of the few organizations that ascribes a kind of generational term to like that moment in the left. So I guess the question would be like, would you be able to expand on like how the category of the millennial left emerged? Like when the anti-war movement emerged, was there a sense of there's kind of like a generational revival, or a moment that some people are going to be radicalized by, and how can we say there's a how long it goes on for, if it you know what I mean? I think just because it's a bit of a fraught category, and I would kind of like to know how we came to that idea of like this generation that kind of rises and falls, and how is that useful maybe to a continued project to register history and how it reappears.
Yes, I think it was interesting. I was also thinking about how there was this sort of moment around Greta Thunberg where the Zoomers were suddenly like, you're going to solve all of our problems in a way that like we've all failed in the past. So there was a kind of recognition that somehow there was a new generation with the Zoomers around that were going to solve all the problems. There was this moment with the millennials as well, right? So there was a lot of projection from the 1960s and 1980s generations onto millennials around the anti-war movement. And I mean, I think Pam talked about how this kind of like formation of the new SDS was this moment where
can you expect
the Students for a Democratic Society, which was a kind of basically the original Students for a Democratic Society in the 1960s sort of was one of the leading groups organising the anti-Vietnam War protests, and so in the context of the anti-Iraq War movement in the States, there was a kind of revival of this idea of the new SDS, which millennials took up and participated in, and yet there was a kind of tension even there about how much they were leading it and how much it was actually the boomer generation that were kind of like leading that movement. Although I think there was a kind of moment where the millennials tried to kind of take things forward, and certainly so I think there was I suppose again this is part of what I was trying to get at with how it was maybe only possible in retrospect to recognize it. I mean, obviously all this stuff sort of happened, and then there were protests about it, and lots of people of different generations were participating in the anti-war protests. It wasn't just millennials by any means. So I guess. However, I guess there was a generation of activists which were politicized around that moment, and some of those people are the people that we've had kind of in conversation and kind of in our milieu in Platypus to kind of work through, like on our panels, to kind of work through some of these ideas. And I think, I guess we've also tried to bring different generations in who have perspective of these different moments, and that seems to have been kind of important to us in Platypus to kind of like bring a kind of millennial Marxist into conversation with like a boomer activist of some kind, and I guess that has been an attempt to kind of try to understand the continuity and change within politics over that period, and sometimes and often to understand what has been forgotten. I guess.
Can I just add something on that? I think there's something that I don't really like, or is a bit perverse about talking about Zoomer left, because it takes the aspect of the idea of the millennial left that's just purely biological, or actually just brand advertising, marketing categories, and concedes to it. And the point of like the founding of Platypus and this idea of the new SDS and the millennial left and wasn't just like the generational change, but was a kind of political, a critical political moment between the new left, the sort of veterans of the new left and the younger leftists, and that engagement was critical in the sense, and Pam recounts this in her teaching, and you've also just mentioned this, that at the founding of the new SDS, older members of the original SDS said to them, don't repeat the mistakes that we made, and one of those being, don't become a single issue campaign around the war. Because obviously the New Left was not, the New Left preceded the Vietnam anti-war movement, but that also was the thing around which it kind of crashed and burned. And it was the potential for the millennial left to be something other, something different, something that was not just a kind of continuity of what had come before, which was the Gen X post-millennial, post-political left being just a kind of continuation of the institutionalization of the new left. And it was really about this possibility of having a critical discussion with the legacy of the New Left, of the 56 through to the 70s. That was the kind of potential. And I think when you saw what you saw with the death of the millennial left around the neo-social democratic turn, around 2017, 2016, was a conversation between members of the new left generation and millennials that was not critical in any way, but was a kind of God bless you, we're passing on the torch. And I think we captured some of that on some of our panels with Leo Panich, that there was a kind of collapse of that kind of critical tension. And when we've engaged with people like Tariq Ali, or through reading Fred Halliday, or many, many interviews that Platypus has done and panel discussions with older New Left members, we've tried to kind of always reconstitute that sort of uneasy critical engagement. But of course, what that led us to very quickly around like 2008, 2009 in Platypus was the recognition that the New Left itself was a kind of failed attempt to deal with the old left of the 30s. And Ian Morrison, who you mentioned, has an article on Baathism. It also is kind of showing how this goes back that deep history, but wrote an article for Platypus on the 30s. And there was a kind of already a premonition that the left would kind of revert to a kind of 30s-ism. And we did kind of see that then with the New Dealism around Obama, and then the neo-social democracy around Sanders and Corbyn. So I just wanted to highlight that kind of aspect of it's not just being around like, oh, every 15 years there's going to be a new generation and they'll have like different tasks, but that there was a kind of a specific critical potential about the legacy of the New Left. And that's why the issue of the anti-war movement was interesting, because it seemed to so explicitly recall Vietnam, and yet somehow pose the potential of not repeating the mistake, which was to actually collapse the left, the potential for rebuilding a broader like socialist left, socialist parties, reconsidering the whole history of Marxism and its application to the present into the Vietnam anti-war movement. And the kinds of things that happened with the breakup of the SDS was that people became Maoists or terrorists, or there was a kind of similar kind of radical chic left turn.
Or on the flip side,
into the 70s.
Oh, on the flip side, liquidation into the Democratic Party.
Right, and liquidation into the Democratic Party through the George McGovern campaign, 1972, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Just quickly, I think, however, there was perhaps a difference between the anti-war movements during the Vietnam period and Iraq that Moshe Pesto points out in History and Hopelessness, that essentially, during the Vietnam period, there wasn't simply a pure anti-Americanism. The intervention there was opposed especially strongly because the cause, the communist ideology for which the Viet Cong were fighting, was regarded positively. Now, of course, in the case of Iraq and Saddam's ferocious regime, you couldn't do the same. But what the left could have said is, we're opposing the intervention. At the same time, we want to see some kind of transformative change within Iraqi society, and they could have turned to the Iraqi Communist Party in that respect, but they failed to do that. And what you kind of emerged was a kind of just a pure anti-Americanism, and Saddam's Ba'athist, essentially fascist regime, was treated as like a black box, just kind of bracketed, put to the side. I think something similar is happening with regard to Hamas today by much of the left. Is kind of, there's obviously understandable fury at what Israel is doing. At the same time, the issue of Hamas and so on is just kind of, as I say, bracketed. Which is, that's.
Yeah. Hang on, over here.
You first, ma'am. I just want to go back to that moment at some stage in your talk where you were talking about this experience of being at the protest and talking to the SWP person and them kind of posturing as somehow expressing what the entire mass of people at this protest are saying. And this is a very broad question, really, but as a specific example, like how do we know that when we are talking about the kind of confuseness of some positions by the left, or bracketing, for example, Hamas or so on, but also by the kind of more radical positions of, defend it with whatever it takes or something. I sometimes get the impression that maybe it's sometimes too easy to try to find a coherent position in what is actually several different positions that to us appear as a single mass, kind of. Because I think what it speaks to is a kind of differentiation between, are we talking about the self-proclaimed Marxist left? Are we talking about the self-proclaimed socialist left? Or are we just talking about people who go to protests that might plausibly be left in some way? And I feel like probably the large mass of people who are on the Saturday rallies and so on, they probably don't endorse Hamas. They are like, oh yeah, bombing people is bad, I like peace, I like democracy, these are nice things. Apparently there's less of them now than before the 7th of October, so yeah, I'm gonna go and protest. And probably don't have like a very, there's no single opinion that we can find or glean from them. And similarly, I'm sometimes I think millennial left and new left as well, they make a lot of sense as kind of like periodizations of politics as such, or capitalist politics and socialist politics as such, but they don't. I'm a bit uneasy about in what ways they correspond to certain positions, because there is so much, and of course we also talk a lot about internal divisions within the left, so it's no big insight that these periods don't correspond to single positions, but instead more like problem categories, for example, and so on. But I don't know. I don't exactly know what I'm trying to say.
I think.
What do you think about this problem of like articulating the distinction between these different layers of the left, if you will, the kind of Marxist, the kind of more anti-liberal, let's say, or critical or something, and then just the kind of go with the flow left, and just the general people who get caught up in the events?
Well, I tried to articulate it a bit by talking about the liberal discontents that I kind of did witness, and I think probably myself was sort of sympathetic to, in a sense. I didn't vote for the war. It was it did feel like it was done on spurious grounds, but I think the other thing was there was this feeling of, well, it felt like it was a fait accompli. It was kind of already going to happen. So it was there was a kind of just a registering of disagreement almost, which is sort of fine. I guess, but I do think there was an elision in the way that when I was talking about the SWP member who was talking to me, there was an elision, I think, between what the SWP thought they were doing, how they thought that they were probably leading a in a sense, a unity of Marxists, and then the movement as a whole was doing, and in their kind of, I guess, in their attempt to appeal to me as a young person, there was this kind of elision. But we also need to be, I guess, you're saying also that we in Fatwa should be careful of aligning these things
Yeah.
as well. So say that everyone on the protest is, certainly not everyone on the protest is pro-Hamas, but I guess the question is, who like to what end is the protest happening, and in terms of leadership, where is it leading to?
Yeah.
Can I
yes.
add something there? 'Cause
Yeah.
I thought leadership is the kind of question there. Because on some level, the left will deny that it's even seeking to lead social discontents, never mind society at large. And on another level, it is seeking. That is the inheritance and at any given time, when even when it's actually tailing capitalist politics one way or another, there is a sort of level between that tailing and not quite admitting itself to be an attempt at leadership, that it is still an attempt to bring social forces together and forge some kind of political organisation, however amorphous or temporary, and that you can judge that over time. Like, for example, the Occupy period, clearly there was an anarchist moment that led the left, and people fell into line behind that, or got involved, even if critically. And at other periods, it's anti-imperialism. It's for some reason this sectarian group achieves a certain prominence among young people. But it's a judgment, and it's possible to be wrong about that judgment.
And just quickly jumping in on that, like the question of leadership, is it also perhaps the thing that emerges from this is that Marxist groups like to pretend, or like kind of take up an intellectual position where they attempt to say like, if we were leading this moment, what would we do, or something like that. But even though they are not in fact leading the moment,
because that's another religion. Is that if we were and we
but they are like, we are Marxists. There is a mass event happening. There is a certain relation between Marxists and left, like mass events, and that it is that Marxists do what like Lenin did, and like give the analysis of the moment and I don't know, say what the right position is and take leadership. But actually, the causal relationship is completely different than. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's what I tried to point to with this kind of hypothetical. It's like, if we were bigger, this is what we would do. And also, it's sort of similar to what the Spartacists would do as well, which is to say we should participate in this in order to put forward our position to demonstrate leadership. But there is some self-awareness that it's a hypothetical because they're not leading, and so it's a curious. I guess one of the other accusations that platypus get is that we're sort of because we don't take positions, we're very abstract in some way. But actually, there's an abstract character to the attempts that like leftist groups also make. Can
I just quickly follow up on that point, which is, it goes back to what Lucy was saying about like there's something very like unremarkable about people demonstrating against like the murder of civilians or like an illegal invasion of another country. What's really weird and should totally freak everyone out is when someone says imperialism, we need a revolution. Like that's not like an obvious thing to say. It's clearly like a historically, ideologically conditioned statement. So we're interested in, why are those people saying that? And we're interested in the people who are attracted to why those people might be saying that. And that goes to the other aspect of leadership and ideology, which is education. So part of the kind of proposition that Platypus made is, what's actually happening on these protests is that young people are being miseducated, about what's happening in the present, in the real world, and B, about the history of Marxism. and that because the left isn't actually providing any political leadership, they aren't actually organising a party or seeking to provide an independent pole of attraction or have some actual politics, but all they're doing is this miseducation. And so, like Lucy was saying, platypus is seen as abstentionist and even as apologising for imperialism by saying, we need to have an educational project. But actually the point is that what the left is doing is a bad, unself-recognised education project, and we're trying to kind of make that conscious.
I remember a moment when Richard Seymour, formerly of the SWP, was cornered at one point, and maybe it was on a podcast, and someone said to him, "Why Corbyn? Why this? What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, that's where the left is." And I was like, this was before Platypus, but I remember just being so confused by that. Aren't you the left? So that it's the left is sort of chasing its own tail, but not to stand on the spot, but to go into the Labour Party. So obviously that need not be said in this room, but for the all roads lead to the Labour Party, of course, in everything we're saying.
Matusz.
Yeah. So, I've heard the New Left's ultimate results be described as, I don't know who this quote comes from, but probably someone in this room will know, that it lost politically, but it won culturally. And it resulted in, and it engaged in the long march through institutions, which resulted in, kind of establishment of New Left, let's call it sensibilities and academics and so on, in all corners of academia and mainstream society. And I really wonder how the fact that the New Left decided to do this, and that that it got accommodated in this particular way into capitalism, into society at large, influenced the millennial left. And can we say that it ultimately proved to be just a failed strategy?
Yeah, I think.
Or is this precisely where this critical moment and perhaps lost potential of the millennial left comes from?
I think there's a couple of things. One, I think some New Leftists would recognise something of the defeat, that there was a kind of almost like a retreat into the institutions. It wasn't necessarily desirable, even for the New Leftists. However, yes, that those institutions. The millennial left got its education through those institutions, and our kind of whole cultural sensibility, in a sense, was informed by those institutions. And I suppose there's both phenomena of identity politics we could see as part of that, of the kind of institutionalization of the New Left, but also the way in which activist groups in reality actually operate as subcultures. It's actually a kind of it's a subcultural kind of social activity. It's not actually politics, and there is a kind of sense of that is sort of what you're participating in when you're in a kind of leftist group, rather than actual politics. I suppose that would be the other thing to say. Yeah.
I was going to say something sort of interesting that came out in the discussion as well, is comparing these three moments, which are the Vietnam anti-war movement, the sort of Iraq and Afghanistan anti-war moment, and then the present. And it got me thinking about the category of an anti-war movement per se, and how what's being called back to often and invoked is the concept of imperialism. but it doesn't seem obvious that you could describe what was happening around the First World War on the socialist left as an anti-war movement. There was like pacifism, but pacifism was also kind of an epithet leveled against opponents of the war by people like Lenin. So it seems like the category of anti-war movement is itself a kind of new left phenomenon, let's say, maybe around Vietnam. But
or you could say it's kind of an old left, like the kind of international organizations for peace.
Pacifism, yeah.
We're kind of Stalinist. Stalinist.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing that got me thinking about this is whether, obviously there are analogies between the present and this earlier moment, and that's what's inspired you to do this, but I'm not sure, it's unclear to what extent you could even call this like an anti-war movement in some ways.
In the present?
Yeah. And I think that maybe comes to this question of, well, what are the historic categories being invoked here? Like, it's perhaps more weird than ever now that the category of imperialism is being invoked. But personally, I don't think that's being brought in by these sectarian groups. I think it's quite fringe, it's quite marginal. Right, the main categories are categories like settler colonialism and genocide and apartheid, and they're much more clearly inheritances of the new left, right? And specifically like a kind of degraded, half-digested version of like academic new left, which gets to this question of gets to what Mateus was bringing up, and like the whole question about, is there a Zoomer left? It's like, if there is, or insofar as the Zoomers are on the left, or the newest generations are on the left, they've just imbibed this very mushy version of like several generations passed down, Chinese whispers, new left kind of concept. And I think that's what we're dealing with, and that's why it's kind of hard to like illuminate the present in some ways, because
sorry, I'm interrupting, but like, if platypus didn't exist, it couldn't be invented in this present moment. Like, it couldn't be produced.
I don't know what
That's what you were saying. I was like,
No.
No, I think that's a good point about the categories. Yeah, maybe we need to dig into those a bit more. But like,
I don't know. There was a lot on the table there, but it was just inspired.
Yeah.
by the discussion in general.
Yeah, plus to follow up Stanley's point on the question of imperialism seems to be out, but settler colonialism isn't. And I was wondering how this could be more blinding as it was back. How settler colonialism today is more of a blind term used by Zoomers compared to where millennials would use imperialism.
Well, I guess it is. I mean, it was being used back then about Israel-Palestine, but Israel-Palestine wasn't quite. There was that question there even then, but it wasn't front and center as it was now. So, but I think I kind of tried to point to in terms of just like going back to Lenin, I was trying to point out how like colonialism, modern colonialism was kind of recognized as a kind of an effect of an imperialism rather than a cause. I think I mean that's certainly not how I don't. Yeah, I'd need to kind of think more about how Zoomers today are using it. I'm not quite sure, but it is quite a vague in that sense. But that I was trying to show how colonialism, in the same way that colonialism might be an effect rather than a cause of modern imperialism, decolonization is also a very kind of like murky attempt to manage capitalist states. It's not emancipatory socialist project. So maybe there's something in pointing out something like if decolonizing is still the language we're using today, maybe that's something we could address further.
I mean, that's also, I suppose, I mean, relevant to what I was saying, that I think that even the meaning of decolonisation has changed, and it's much closer to, like, it's much more of an academic inheritance, even if that's not necessarily acknowledged. Then, you know, it's not. I don't think when people speak about that today, which they do, they chiefly have in mind like the kind of, you know, the movements of the 1950s and 60s, but rather something much more nebulous, which is kind of like...
Which is really more about identity politics, it's just being anti-white people.
yeah, basically.
Well, as anti-white people with no clear goal to resolve it in any way.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. So some of what people seem to be operating in, how they talk, particularly like terms like apartheid, decolonisation and things, seem to be in the terrain of a sort of post-war liberal human rights framework, and very much like taking their cues from organisations like the UN or the Human Rights Watch or even better level, Amnesty. And I suppose you've touched on that a bit, and ideas around kind of liberal anti-war ideology, but I don't know if you kind of could go into that a wee bit, that kind of I don't know what that link or that framework or I guess what makes these movements left necessarily. They seem to be kind of operating in this not particularly left framework.
I think I was sort of, I mean, there's this, I think it would be okay if we could just call them liberal movements in a sense. I'm not sure, although even, you know, what we mean by liberalism would have to be unpacked there. But I guess Platypus's role was trying to kind of focus on Marxism and consider why it is that the Marxists in the present were kind of just supporting a kind of liberal kind of consensus. Sorry, do you want to jump in?
Just jumping in on that topic, because I think you talks to something that I was trying to slightly confusedly gesture at, which is that to me, the Zoomer left as such, or like my generation of people, seem to, if they identify as leftist or Marxist or something, what they are very anxious about, and what I used to be very anxious about, is like not being a liberal. And I don't know what the precise history of this is, but to me, I don't know, but to me the kind of hinge of the moment is not really like reappropriating old Marxist terms or something. It is using these academic-y terms created by like the legacy of like US retreat into the institutions and all that process, like decolonization meaning something, you know, post-structural strange thing, vague thing, and settler colonialism and apartheid. So there are these very like identity politics-y bits, but then I feel like one of the key conflicts between leftist individuals is like, is thinking certain things being a liberal, and to some people, you know, identity politics is ultimately being a liberal, and to some other people, like identity politics is already like not being liberal but being radical or whatever. And I feel like that's the kind of I don't know how to process that in the kind of platypus way of looking at things, this anxiety that I feel in people my age and younger about like not being libs. And that being the key, like, I don't know, anxiety about being a leftist.
Maybe this goes to the radical veneer.
It's the 1930s.
It's the D word. It's the D word.
The D word.
Donald Trump. right? It's that the libs were the people who failed to defeat Donald Trump, and the libs were the people who failed to stop Brexit. And there's a kind of the need to have a more radical response, right? The idea is that the role of the left is to be the people who will really beat Donald Trump and beat Brexit, and that to do that you can't have Hillary Clinton, who's a liberal, or you can't have David Cameron and Tony Blair, who are the liberals, who claim to uphold whatever. You have to be. I think it's a post 2016 phenomenon, and I mean, maybe I'm being slightly facetious and oversimplifying things, but I think that is a big part of it. At least my experience of how that kind of fuck the libs rhetoric came about is post 2016 about opposition to that. And just to throw a spanner in the works, we are in this weird moment now where also two spanners in that. One is that the outcome of the anti-war movement was to elect Obama, the ultimate lib in a way, who continued the wars, right? And that's when the anti-war movement kind of collapsed. Now we're in this weird moment where there was this kind of Donald Trump being an anti-war candidate, but now we're in this rehash. It's Joe Biden as president, David Cameron's back in office, and so what the hell does that mean for where we are now? So I think that the continued purchase of that now is people's discontent with the fact that they basically voted Biden in, and first of all, the war in Ukraine has erupted, and the US is obviously very involved in that, and now war or chaos or Israel and Palestine.
Can I jump in real quick as well to Ewan's question? It's interesting to think about things like human rights as something that emerged as a phenomena post, I think it's the Second World War, and you have a massive collapse of the left, especially and you get the reification of kind of Trotskyism, and you have the further bureaucratization of the USSR. In the absence of kind of an internationalist leftist politics, you get the phenomena of human rights. And I think the way it's reappropriated in the present, even the previous anti-war movement, it's a frustration with phrasing it another way, a lot of the motivating tendency behind platypus that emerges in the early 2000s is a question of why do we still need Marxism, right? So why do you need to be a Marxist, or why should we point towards Marxism in a situation where we would also where demands for human rights seem necessary but also insufficient, right? And that is exactly where Marx comes in. It's a freedom problem. It's liberalism in crisis within capitalism, and that's been the question that Marxists have been trying to answer to various conscious and unconscious, attempts. And that's kind of where you would start reading history against the grain, right? It's history against the grain, but also push the historical symptomology in the present. So you'd encounter a young person who's encountering Maoism, for example, and you might ask them, okay, so what's the necessity for a research, for turning back to the thoughts of Mao in 2023? And they say, okay, well, we know that liberalism is inherently hypocritical, or it doesn't go far enough, and so the actors of history, or like the potential for freedom in history, actually lies with kind of like the peasantry, or the alliance between peasants and workers, or maybe like as an example, right? And I think that's kind of like exactly kind of where the issue is, like the problem of liberalism. That's exactly what Marx is trying to address, and we are haunted by that question 200 years later. And it's strange that the left keeps running into that problem of like, okay, what is necessary to realize democracy? And the left could say, well, it's like overcoming capitalism, and then that's like where it really starts to splinter.
And another example of this problem, I guess, is that this is sort of where Halliday ends up. He actually, in a sense, renounces Marxism, Leninism. He sort of enters the academia, and he does become a defender of human rights. Like, he's a political scientist teaching at LSE, and his kind of final works. He's sort of one of these figures, a bit like Christopher Hitchens, where it's like, I didn't leave the left left me. But he's I guess disenchanted with the project of Marxism, and reduced in a sense to like the kind of politics of human rights, and sort of upholding liberalism, I guess. And so that's how all of these symptoms that we kind of deal with, they do have a kind of partial truth to them, I guess. And so we should keep in mind all these things. Like,
yes, to carry on from that, and a comment you made, Lucy, where you said, if only it was a liberal movement. I wondered if you could maybe say what you meant by that, because it made me think, the way I was interpreting it is like, and something we've discussed is this idea of like the right of nations to self-determination, right? And that is a liberal demand. That's a kind of Woodrow Wilson phrase that is taken up by socialists and Marxists and like given a certain gloss and used strategically.
I suppose all I meant was that there is then this kind of veneer of radicalism to it, or and Marxists will sort of take it up as a movement to support sort of uncritically, and if it could be recognised as such, as a kind of
right. I
liberal.
see. I think that what I'm raising is like maybe part of the problem is that it's sort of sub-liberal in some ways, right? Like
sure.
there is, and it's trying to pass out the elements which are and aren't that, right? So we could say, well, what is the democratic element here? Like, what are the democratic demands of this protest movement? And it's generally seems to be like the discontent seems to mainly be with like Keir Starmer's comments on, or like, it's like, well, what can we actually change from here, right? And that's seen as mainly being like material support that the British government gives to Israel, right? That seems to be like, you were saying like, we didn't vote, there was the whole, not in our name, we didn't vote for this, right? I think that's fainter in a way, that like it would be a question of trying to draw that out and to understand it in that light. And thinking about how these like sub-liberal elements coexist with it, right? Like, because from a sort of straightforwardly liberal perspective, you would probably, I mean, this is debatable, but you would probably also have to recognise the right of Israelis to self-determination, right? Or there would be some kind of contradiction there. or that would have to be thought about. But often that doesn't seem to enter it. But then you get the whole question of if it's an illegitimate such as the colonial state, then they have no right to self-determination. That's the way people fudge that question.
So that's the element that's sub-liberal, because it's about returning the world to a state where everyone lives in their correct native area. And
yeah, but
that's where the
choice.
again,
depending.
Sorry, I've written this speaker. It doesn't.
Hang on. For the recording, what are people? Can we speak one at a time?
I think Joe's.
Yeah, it's good that wasn't captured on tape.
Just quickly, I remember listening to Chris Cutrone once say that Woodrow Wilson supported this kind of right to self-determination emanates from this racism, really. As you say, like everybody lives in their own separate ethnic region and so on. You stick to your own kind of thing. It's not really there's a liberal sheen to it. But
Right. So it's liberal, but it's already sub-liberal.
Yes.
yeah, which is where ID politics come into play. Huh?
That was part of Rebecca's point, right? That it's this kind of crisis of liberalism. Rebecca.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was about to ask Rebecca. You say this as a symptom of this of the left turning away from liberalism altogether, but I would say, are there any other symptoms of that turn away from liberalism other than the reliance on identity politics, or is that merely just a case of that?
I think the point I was trying to make is that, the reason Platypus picks up Marxism as a phenomena, as a historical phenomena, is because we're investigating the conscious movement of the left and the left's ability to realize utopia, right? This is like a very, very basic starting point. And Marx's proposal of what is the problem with society, what is the problem that is preventing us from realizing a utopia or freedom in society, is liberalism or bourgeois society coming into self-contradiction, right? And this problem manifests in history ideologically, politically, in different ways. And, until, and again, the thing is, like, Marx could be wrong. And, maybe there is a deeper problem of society that no longer implicates a contradiction of liberalism and capitalism. But I think, insofar as we have been unable to surpass Marxism in terms of, like, consciousness, right? Like, Marxism was trying to be as conscious as possible about what society is, what is the problem with society, and what would be necessary to overcome it. That initial, the issue of liberalism being insufficient is going to keep coming up. And that could manifest in things like identity politics, it could manifest in things like, anarcho-primitivism, right, is the other one, just to take it away from, like, the authoritarian, or, like, one side of the left could manifest as, like, a authoritarian anti-liberalism, and then there's kind of, like, an anarcho, like, anti-liberalism, like, we need to return back, to the sub-liberal. I think that's just kind of the point I was making, and then that's what we're trying to make, trying to highlight when these flare-ups happen in the left, when there seems to be, like, a revival, a resurgence, is how is this old question, how is, like, what appears to be new actually a manifestation of the old in distress, and the old on a less conscious level. Like, that's really the issue. So earlier this year we went to, I think Joe and you attended, we went to 20 years since the anti-war movement, right? So it was like February of this year that marked the 20th anniversary of the anti-war movement. And it was held by, the SOPP were there, Counterfire were there, so the subsequent split from the SWP, and other organizers like Jeremy Corbyn from the anti-war Stop the War Coalition. And they were extremely depressed, but just because there was a recognition that had failed, that attempt had failed, but there was also a refusal to do anything with that, right? To register that as actually a vital failure of responsibility on the left to carry those, to carry that problem forward into something more productive. And instead what was happening was apologetics, right? Well, it couldn't have happened any other way, or this is what we did manage to do. There are certain countries that are no longer putting their currency to the dollar. They're now turning towards like the Chinese currency. I don't know what they use currently, but yeah, that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that this will manifest in a lot of different ways, and that's what we're trying to make conscious of, like how that issue keeps coming back, and how, you know, Marxism didn't see the problem as a kind of anti-liberalism or sub-liberalism. It's a contradiction of liberalism itself, which has to be worked through politically, right? And that's still, like, we haven't been able to really surpass that kind of task yet, right? Like, since 1917 or 1923, or 19, you know, however, wherever you kind of want to put the early 20th century kind of deadline, we've fallen below that horizon of Marxism and that ability to understand society, precisely because of, you know, the splintering of the working class movement, of, you know, obstacles put up in the 20th century that have become reified in the 21st century.
Well, one thing you could ask there then is what might have been learned from
right, or whose responsibility is it
because
to
you're
talk about the failure
in a very
right?
abstract sense, like, well, they could have realized that it was a failure and could have taken responsibility for that, which is sort of the beginning of a reflection. But where might it have gone? And it's, in some ways, it's impossible to answer, because that would be to sort of ask to draw positive lessons from it and say, well, they should have made this decision or that decision, but even just to point towards, well, what, you know, because you were talking around these ideas of left unity and how that was maybe a failed strategy, and what it ended up actually leading to
was Corbyn, was like momentum.
Yeah,
Corbyn, right?
Yeah, but just maybe you could give some suggestion of, well, what potential was there, that, you know, because that's what we're trying to recover, right? It's like to say there was some potential in this moment. That's why we even talk about it as the millennial left. There was a potential for it to be something to have come into its own. What, from your sort of personal point of view, like where was the high point?
If I can just give one more way of phrasing this question, how is the millennial left insufficiently unorthodox in how it took up the task at hand and how it repeated or failed to repeat the new left did?
So it's tricky for me, I guess. I mean, I was, although I was kind of witnessed the anti-war movement and kind of went to some meetings, you know, I actually only really engaged with the left in Platypus. So
Yeah.
I guess the high point for me was meeting Platypus. But you know,
and why was that?
in really because, like, I guess it gave me the freedom to think about freedom. I guess, and it gave me the freedom to kind of step back from what seemed to already be a losing battle, to kind of recognize that so I had been to a few meetings. This is sort of the stuff that they were talking about, but I couldn't really enter into it without taking a a step back. So I think for me, and maybe that's also to do with the moment I came to Platypus. Just although I was of the same generation as the founding members, I didn't meet Platypus until basically the election of Obama. But you know, that in itself was like, oh, okay, that there's a group in the States that are actually saying, like, putting a question mark over Obama. That for me itself was kind of revelatory, and felt like, yeah, what does it actually mean to elect, to be kind of wishing Obama into power and wishing Obama was the like anti-war candidate? And is that really why is the left doing that? Is it because he's black? Like what does that have to do with the price of anything? Like it was just kind of oh gosh, okay, yeah, what is it really that you know, I sort of in a broad sense thought of myself as like progressive, but like, well, you know, but really what does that mean? So
Can I sort of follow up? Because I think in some ways my own experience with joining Platypus around like the Corbyn moment is probably quite similar. And I think in some ways, if you're already only half in, right? So you say like, really you felt you hadn't engaged that much with the left before finding Platypus. It's quite easy to that disillusioning process is actually the easy part, right? To say, well, this is going nowhere. Like, I always sort of suspected this was a little bit bunk or whatever, right? That, you know, these constant protests that the SWP are putting on and the placards they're distributing, that seems like, you know, pseudo activity. But I wonder if you could talk more about, well, what did it help you appreciate about, what did you take more seriously because of it? You know, you're referring back to like these left unity projects. I think maybe.
If I seemed like I was dismissing them, that wasn't my intention.
No, that's why I'm bringing that up, because I think it may not have been the case that you would have thought that was important at all if you hadn't found Platypus, right?
Sure.
You would have seen that as even more wrong-headed and sort of futile than what was happening, because, you know.
Well, I think in a way.
Well, I'm putting words in your mouth, but like that's how I.
It gave me a new appreciation. Like it did give me a kind of sympathy with the left in a sense. In that I was like, well, you know, encountering this idea of this earlier point in history where there were mass political movements for socialism. Like, what would it take to rebuild something like that? And who knows, maybe it would be about doing anti-war movement protests, or having a kind of unity electoral politics, or it could be any number of these things. And yet these things didn't seem to be leading anywhere in the present. So they were partial answers to the questions, I guess, but it at the same time, that's what made it difficult. Like you could, like, I guess that's actually the difficult thing for a lot of people joining Platypus, is actually there's a kind of sense of, oh, maybe we're not smarter than the rest of the left, and that like we can't think that we have all the answers, because actually, you know, the left is sort of trying to give voice to like certain bits of this memory of something, of what it would take to transform society, and we do need more unity projects, but unity on what grounds, and like, you know, how do we kind of what would how would we kind of on what basis, and what interventions should we be making, but also I guess probably the other thing I think possibly I was trying to wrestle with in this presentation, or trying to point towards, is actually confronting politics per se. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I suppose the death moment of the millennial left was actually, in a sense, also the moment where perhaps it was most closely confronted with politics.
Yeah, that was something that stuck out to me. Yeah, and I wonder.
Meaning Brexit and Trump.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to see if such a moment comes out of this. I'm not sure. People might flinch from that.
Well, we wouldn't also, like, some of these things weren't, we could have not foreseen of Trump in 2003.
Right, I think maybe what I'm raising is that, is there an attempt to kind of grasp towards like politics per se at the moment, and to go back to the well, what's the democratic discontent here, and do people have a conception of that, and how that might go anywhere or find expression.
I think but the other sort of aspect of that Lucy was raising is the sense that it feels like a certain kind of continuity with the post-political, or a collapse back into the post-political, or I'm not sure how to really think about it, but I think that's the other kind of...
There's this category of the hyper-political.
Right. But that was sort of not... That was for like a couple of years ago even already, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think maybe it's equally wise. Right.
Yeah. But
anyone who Tom, but also, is there anyone else that hasn't said anything that would like to just like...
I think Ewan had a point much earlier. I don't know.
I have a question, and I don't know how. I don't know, more for my own sake than for anyone else, which is kind of, it might be a bit flippant or facetious, but kind of what is taking this notion of the millennial left and the death of it, which I'm not necessarily convinced with or unconvinced with, but what does it give you as an analysis? And I mean, not necessarily like programmatically or tactically, what do you go do next, but in terms of how is it useful to view the modern left like that, and how is it useful to posit this idea that there was a millennial left and now it's dead? What is the sort of utility of that in a very simple sense?
I think that's something that Ephraim pointed to in one of his articles recently, but this problem of not a critical recognition that the millennials didn't manage to break from the previous history to form something new, and also to learn from the past. So there's a kind of I guess if we're sort of moving forward, we're going to be reckoning with that dead millennial left continuing to kind of inform young people about what it is to be political today, and so I guess it's probably an attempt to kind of arm ourselves with some pointers for young people to kind of not take the positions that are given to them for granted, and to kind of consider, okay, where is this coming from? Yeah.
Can I add?
Yes.
Because I was sort of bringing back my question is sort of connected to this, I suppose. And I also want to redeem my rude interruption of Stanley earlier a little bit, which is to say that and this might be wrong-headed because I wasn't, although I'm your age, I didn't come to platypus until much later. The sense that platypus itself is marked by the millennial left, by its participation in it, its complicity in it, its at its best, critical recognition of the millennial left's potential, which is difficult to talk about sometimes. It's difficult to take seriously sometimes that there was something else that could have happened, and the moment now is different to that. But platypus will remain marked by that. Like the platypus is kind of always going to be kind of affected by that history, and it's how we use that. And will we be able to remember and tell people the truth about the experiences we've had? Like the way platypus educated itself over those first 10 years, like say 10 years, 2007 to 2017. It was a kind of cousin of the millennial left, which was also going through its own kind of sentimental education. And we don't live in that world anymore. If we don't take the Zoomer left as a sort of serious proposition, there isn't a left going through the education that the millennial left attempted to kind of go through one way or another. And it is sort of down to platypus to sort of maintain that memory. And to be available to educate people who want to know. So I guess the question in that is does that story give too much? Is it too romantic about the originating moment of platypus that there was something was going on, in a way that is not the case now, that there was a stirring, at large, and that platypus sought to be the most kind of negatively conscious kind of component of that, but really was part of something bigger than itself. Whereas now we are sometimes seen to be on another planet in a different way.
So I would say, I think it's like we've. I think I guess the potential, as I see it, was that that questions were being asked, and that in a sense, that moment was a moment for we did in the first generation educate ourselves through. It wasn't just in the reading group or just in the panels, but it was a way of we'd bring the left in conversation on the panels. We'd hear certain arguments where the left would take up fragments of this history, whether it be United Fronts, and it was in the context of this moment that we were then grappling with the history. I guess, and that is a problem. If we don't have the left, I mean, this is something we have discussed already in Platypus. If we don't have another left there to kind of take up those fragmentary, misrecognitions, as Pam talked about, then do we have anything to chew over the history with, alongside it? I'm not sure, but I guess so. This is where this problem of trying to inhabit or be a symptom is ourselves as teachers is kind of, we'll see how useful it is, I guess. we'll try.
I think the concept, this is answering both the question actually of you and about the millennial left as a concept, and the earlier question about what I mean, from my perspective, what was it that Platypus made me take seriously? And I think the strength of the idea of the millennial left is it makes you stop and think about oh my god, maybe I live in like historical time, right? Like there is a period that just passed, and of course it's hypothetical, like, and it has no usefulness in the sense that we don't have real political forces that we are managing, and therefore we can test the usefulness of our concept. It has a pedagogical or educational use of like being like, you live in history. We all are living in history, and the same way, you can get to, I don't know, any famous person with like through 6 contacts or handshakes or whatever in the world. You can get back to the big historical themes through like surprisingly few mediations between you and the big stuff. Turns out if you just scratch the surface, suddenly it's like past war movements, and then those actually tie into like the Second International, and those tie into like great historic defeats. And I think it's this sort of, I don't know, to me it's this sort of catalyst where like, oh my god, things, maybe things don't feel like they're happening right now, but actually it's only like a few steps removed from the Russian Revolution. Like we are right now a few steps removed from the world of Lenin in ways that we might not be, what do we do with that? It's kind of crazy that we can just go on in our everyday life and ignore that, no? And to me that's, I don't know.
I guess it's something about having that tension between that moment and also the loss.
Yeah, exactly. But there's the kind of two sides of the same coin, and to me that is the significance of platypus. I guess is a way of thinking about the left, and I think what the death of the millennial left is useful for is kind of kickstarting that form of thinking.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to be romantic about. We should probably close up soon, but yeah.
I was just. Can I ask one last question?
Yeah.
Because part of my experience with platypus was first into the defeat of Corbynism in 2019, and I sort of went into it for looking for a local leftist group in my area as a kind of coping with the defeat of Corbynism.
As a coping mechanism.
Yeah, a little bit, but at least get somebody to read Marxism to me, like in person. But I didn't really
read you some soothing Marxism to kind of as a balm.
All the arts. You found platypus.
I would give it from a 20 book. Yeah, that bomb. Okay. But yeah, I didn't really take platypus all that seriously, even during the BLM moment where it was just at the peak of my leftism. It was only after what I've seen. It was only after the election of Joe Biden and what has come up of BLM that I started to grow a massive distaste towards BLM and started to take platypus more seriously as to jump on his point. We see we're a few steps removed from Leninism, but even compared to recent history of the '60s civil rights movement, we seem to be less effective than we were even back then, and to rope it back into the
you mean the platypus, or you mean the left?
Well, the left in general.
The left. And
to rope it back to the anti-war movement is just something that's particularly striking to me is that compared to the anti-war movement of even 10, 20 years ago, compared to now, seems to be much more powerful in spite of the in spite of its various problems, and in spite of the 2000s being much weaker than the 60s. And now we're in this more worrying position where even the offerings that we have now are even less effective than 20 years ago. So,
yeah. I mean, I just to come back on the soothing Marxist balm. I guess we have to consider ourselves the splinter in the ointment. We have to like push against things a bit and make people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And if we've lost our, you know, this is platypus I'm talking about now. I think if there's a kind of necessity to. I think that's what I meant about the kind of undesirable necessity of platypus, that we have to kind of hold that discomfort about the state of the world and the left, if we're to kind of like try and keep a grasp on it. But I'll leave it there. Okay. Right, thank you.